Welcome everyone. Welcome back to this 7-part webinar series on EU GMP updates and the regulatory horizon. I hope you enjoyed the first module, and now across the series, just as an intro, I'll explain that what we are actually looking at. So in this series, we will look at both sides of the current regulatory landscape, what has already changed, what is coming next. The focus is not only on reading the updates, but also on understanding what they mean in practice for the GMP sites, the QPs, quality teams, manufacturing, regulatory affairs, supply chain teams, and most importantly, the inspection readiness. So let's start with the module 2 of 7, and the focus of this session is modernizing the pharmaceutical quality system. In this module, we look at the wider legislative landscape, the changes happening around EU pharmaceutical law, supply resilience, decentralized manufacture, and the PQS, QP responsibilities, and regulatory dimensions. In this module, we will move one level deeper into the GMP system itself. So, as I covered the module 1 summary, let's start module 2, the PQS framework. This is a framework that holds everything together. It's just not a collection of SOPs or quality forms. It's the way an organization ensures that products are consistently manufactured, controlled, and released to the required quality standard throughout their life cycle. We will look at the theory connected development. First, the proposal revision of EU GMP Chapter 1, which strengthened the expectations around the quality risk management, knowledge management, product quality reviews, and senior management oversight. Second, the proposed changes to Annex 15, especially the possible extension of qualification validation expectations to active substances, active pharmaceutical ingredients. And third, the PQS effectiveness pilot, which signals how regulatory may increasingly assess whether a quality system is genuinely effective or just whether procedures exist. So for trainee QPs, this is a very important module. The QP certification decision depends on the confidence in the PQS. And trainees are actually the SMEs of PQS. So practical question throughout this session is that can the site show with evidence that its quality system is working as intended? This is the mindset I want you to apply as we go through this module. So, learning objectives. So, by the end of this webinar, there are 5 things. I basically want you to be comfortable. What is changing in the draft EU GMP Chapter 1? And the knowledge management as PQS pillars, strengthening the product quality review and the management review. What are the new expectations for trending, the data, risk management, and continual improvement? Annex 15 and qualifications updates will be learned as well. The proposed extension to the active pharmaceutical ingredients and the impact on manufacturer. The EMA PQS effectiveness pilot is also the part of this module, like how regulators are moving beyond the compliance towards measuring the PQS performance, and also preparing for the regulatory horizon, the practical considerations before the revised guidance become effective. So this slide introduces the first major technical update in this module, the proposed revision of EU GMP Chapter 1 Pharmaceutical Quality System. So, chapter one is important because it describes the overall quality system expected at a GMP manufacturing site. It is not just about individual SOPs or isolated quality processes. It sets the expectations for how the whole organization manages the quality, risk, product knowledge, continuous improvement, and senior management oversight. The revision shown here is a joint EMA and PRICS proposal. This is important because it gives the direction is not only for Europeans. PICS alignment means the same thinking may influence the inspection expectations across the international GMP inspectorates. At this stage, the text of the EU GMP Chapter 1 is still in draft. The consultation is closed, but no final adopted version has been published yet. So we should not treat this as an enforceable GMP requirement today. However, it is still highly relevant because it shows where the regulators are moving and what we are going to expect in our future inspections. The main shift is the alignment with ICH 9, revision 1. In simple terms, the quality management system, quality risk management should not be something used only when a deviation occurs or when an inspector asks for a risk assessment. It should also be built in into the decision throughout the product life cycle, from development, technology transfer through the manufacture, routine manufacturing, validating, change control, deviation management, PQR, continuous improvement. The second important is the knowledge management. This is being introduced as a more visible PQS element in this draft. That means the sites need to show how product and process knowledge is captured, maintained, reviewed, and used. Knowledge management was always there in ICHQ 10, and now it's becoming a official part of chapter 1. So the knowledge should not sit in people's head, old reports, emails, or isolated spread works anymore. The third point is the expansion of the product quality review and quality risk management expectations. The product quality review should become more meaningful and more connected to the risk, trend analysis, and the management review. It should help the site to understand whether the process remains in control, the process is still in control, or is just to confirm that an annual report has been written. For example, if a site sees repeated minor deviations, recurrent deviations in the same process step. Now, the revised chapter 1 direction would expect that knowledge to be captured, trended, risk assessed, and fed back into the control strategies. And inspectors are already expecting this and highlighting this in their inspections now. They expect you, when you are doing the risk assessment, you always look the likelihood of the deviation. That likelihood should include the review of the previous deviations if raised, or the frequency of the recurrent deviations for the same issue. So it should not be, it should be the part of the every deviation process, and it should also become the topic of wider learning. The key message for the training QPs here is that even though the revision draft is still in draft, the direction is clear. A modern PQS must be risk-based, life cycle driven, knowledge-led, and evidence-based. The QPs should be able to rely on the PQS because it actively identifies the risk, learns from the experience, and supports sound batch certification decisions. For example, if a deviation should not be investigated and closed, the learning from that deviation should feed into the risk assessments, the kappa training, the PQR training, possibly even specifications of process control review. For example, if you're raising a change control, You should have, in your form, electronic form or a paper copy form, you should have a requirement where you look at, is this change, is a result of a recurrent deviations, or do we have to look at the deviations trend if we're implementing a particular action or a change? Now, this slide focuses on knowledge management. I call it KM because it's just the most important part of my PQS at the moment. And also, the knowledge management is the part of our modernized PQS. And knowledge management, what knowledge management means? Management means is the structured capture, review, and use of information across the full product lifecycle. It includes the development data, technology transfer information, validation reports, manufacturing experience, deviations, CAPAS complaints, PQR trends, post market signals. Historically, many sites have used this knowledge informally. People may know from experience that a process step is sensitive or that a certain supplier has a recurring issue. But that knowledge may not be formally captured or used in the risk assessment. The new Chapter 1 draft gives knowledge management much clearer status. It is no longer just a background activity or something hidden inside the document control. It becomes a recognized part of the PQS sitting along the quality risk management. This means that manufacturing will be the knowledge management will be a major part of the manufacturing data. And we all know that manufacturing is becoming more complex. The sites may be using the outsource activities, decentralized networks, digital system, automated processes, or AI supported tools. In that environment, decisions depend on the data and knowledge held across the different systems and sometimes different sites. And therefore, inspectors are likely to ask different questions, not only what happened, but also how did you capture the learning from, for example, a root cause? Where did that knowledge go? Where did it change your risk assessment, your control strategy, your training, or your specification? For example, imagine a recurring deviation where a tablet compression step repeatedly drift close to the upper force limit. If a deviation is closed separately as no product impact, but the problem or the pattern is not trended, not added to the PQR, not reviewed in the quality risk management, not used to improve the control strategy, then the site has not managed its knowledge effectively. Another simple example is staff experience. If one experienced operator knows how a particular process behaves differently from uh, um, or differently after maintenance or seasonal um, temperature changes. But if this is not reflected in the batch record or your training record, training manuals, validation reports, or risk assessment, that knowledge is fragile. If that person leaves the site today, the site is going to lose critical process understanding. So the key message here is document control is not the same as knowledge management. A document control document tells you what is approved. Knowledge management shows how the organization learns, connects information, and uses that learning to make better quality decisions. For training QPs, this is especially important because badge certification relies on confidence in the system behind the badge. The QP needs assurance that the site is not only collating the data, but actually learning from it and using it to maintain the control. This slide is a comparison of the current and the proposed version of EU GMP Chapter 1. It is intended to highlight where the guidance has evolved rather than to suggest that organization must now make these changes. Many companies have already implemented several of these concepts, particularly quality risk management, knowledge management, and management review through ICH Q10 or their existing pharmaceutical quality system, or as a result of a MHRA inspection or regulatory inspection. The purpose here is simply to understand that what is new or more explicit in the draft revision of Chapter 1. Once the final version is published, each organization should perform its own gaps assessment to determine whether any updates are necessary. Now, we move from Chapter 1 to Annex 15, qualification and validation. So, the concept paper has published, and the final version of the draft is expected in December 2026. Annex 15 is important because it sets the expectations for how facilities, equipment, utilities, processes, cleaning, transport, computerized or automated systems are qualified, validated before they are relied upon in GMP manufacture. The key point on this slide is that Annex 15 is now being targeted for revision by joint EMA and PICS process. As I said, the planned timetable includes discussion through 2026, with European Commission publication and PICS adoption targeted by December 2026. The headline change in the proposed draft is the proposed extension to active substance manufacturing. At the moment, Annex 15 is described as optional supplementary guidance for active substances under UDRELEX Volume 4, Part 2. This is the current scenario, current requirement. The concept paper basically proposing to change that position. So Annex 1 would apply to manufacture of chemical and biological active substances as well. This is very important because active pharmaceutical ingredients are just not just raw materials in practical sense. They carry their own process history, impurity profile, contamination risk, process variability, supplier control changes into the finished product. And if API manufacture is not supported by strong validation, change control discipline, the finished product side may inherit risk. It cannot fully detect at the incoming goods testing. So it's a good news for the finished product manufacturing. The requirement to this revision is also important. EMA links the proposal to lesson learned from the nitrosamine impurity in certain medicine case. The concept paper specifically referred to the gaps in process and knowledge gap, inadequate investigation of quality issues, and insufficient contamination control measures at the active substance manufacturer's site. Now, the new requirement being considered include extended concepts as the validation master file, validation and qualification policy, change control, third-party contract oversight, investigation of fail acceptance criteria, and qualification stages such as URS, FAT, SAT, DQ, IQ, OQ, PQ into an active substance manufacturer. There's also a strong quality risk management angle here. The draft, the concept paper says that the Annex 15 should be updated in line with ICH Q9 with greater use of risk management tools in qualification, validation, monitoring processes, design, and risk review activities. Now, here for training QPs, the practical point is that even where the API is made by a third party, the QP still needs confidence that the active substance entering the finished product has been manufactured under adequate control. For example, if an API supplier changes a solvent recovery process that may affect the residual solvents, impurities, nitrosamine risk, the cleaning strategy, cleaning validation, um, or the process robustness. The finished product size should not simply accept the manufacturer's statement that the change is minor. It should understand whether the change was validated, whether the impurity risk was assessed, whether the API specifications still stay suitable, and whether any impact on the finished product has been considered. So the takeaway is to start early. Map your critical API suppliers now. Request the validation and change control information. Review your technical quality agreements and build Annex 15 readiness into your supplier qualification and audit planning program. This is still a proposal until the final text is adopted, but the direction is clear. The API validation expectations are moving closer to the finished product validation expectations ensured. Now, this slide turns the Annex 15 proposal into practical preparation actions. The first action is to map your API supply chain. Now, do not list the supplier name on the material specification. Identify who actually manufactured the active substance, which site performs the critical process steps, whether any steps are outsourced or whether the supplier is working to a formal qualification or validation framework. This matters because the active, the Annex 15 concept paper proposes moving active substances manufacturers from optional use of Annex 15 as supplementary guidance to a more directly applicable, I would say, qualification validation expectation. The second action is to request the validation documentation from your key API suppliers. That does not mean asking for every single validation report immediately, but start with the evidence such as the validation master file status, qualification and validation policy, cleaning validation strategy, the process validation status, and how validation impacting changes are being controlled. For example, if your API supplier changes a crystallization step, say the solvent recovery process or cleaning agent or outsourced intermediate manufacturer, you need to know what that change was assessed for the process robustness. Where is the impact assessment, risk assessment? Does it tell you about the process robustness, impurity profile, residual solvent risk, cross contamination, and possible impact of the finished product? What are the risks? How the risks are controlled? How what are the action listed for controlling the risk? Are they accepting the risk? Now, the third action is to gap assess your own API sites where applicable. If your organization manufactures API, then compare the current practice against the Annex 15 style expectations, user requirement specification, design qualification, installation qualification, operation qualification, PQ, process validation, your cleaning validation, your transport validation, your change control policy, and the investigation of fail acceptance criteria. The fourth action is to build this into a 2026 audit schedule. Do not wait until the final Annex 15 text is adopted. When we are doing the audits, we supplier qualification, audit scheduling, the technical agreement, updates, we all consider all of this because these updates can take months. And if you wait for such updates Until the final text of the Annex 15 is published, you may not be have enough time to close gaps before inspection is start. Um, s- um, or inspectors are asking you these questions. So the fifth action is to assign cross-functional ownership. Quality assurance should lead the gap assessment, but procurement, supplier, quality, regulatory affairs, validation, manufacturing all needs to be involved, cross-functional. This is not only a validation team issue because API validation weaknesses can affect the supply continuity. The regulatory filings specifications also going to be can be affected. Also stability, impurity control, and QP certification confidence. So for training QPs, the practical message in this slide is the QP may not personally validate the API process, but the QP does need confidence that the API used in the manufacture of a particular batch is under adequate control. Um, the API is actually being manufactured under the required EU GMP requirements. And a GMP certificate alone may not be enough if the risk is high or the supplier has made significant process changes. So the so, key takeaway is simple here. Start with your highest risk API first, especially the single source materials or complex synthesis or biologically active substances, APIs with known impurity concerns, or suppliers with repeated deviations and change notifications. This is still a proposed extension, you all need to remember, but it is sensible and defensible area for early preparation. So this slide is something I always wanted to discuss. And I think this is the most appropriate position here. The PQS effectiveness pilot, which is one of the clearest sign of where inspection thinking is heading. So this pilot is being run by EMA GMP GDP Inspector Working Group. Its purpose is to assess whether a site can demonstrate its quality pharmaceutical quality system. That site is what I'm trying to say is that the site can demonstrate its PQS genuinely effective for the risk-based change management, or whether that effectiveness could be evidenced through the EEA GMP certificate. This is important because the strong PQS is becoming linked to the regulatory flexibility. In other words, a site can show it manages the changes well. Regulators may become more comfortable with allowing certain changes to be handled through the risk-based life cycle rather than requiring repeated prior regulatory approvals. The pilot connects directly to ICH Q10 and Q12 principles. For a site, this is not just having a change control SOP. This means that the site would need to show real evidence that the system actually works. The evidence includes robust change governance, clear ownership, scientifically justified quality risk management um, outputs. Your risk assessments have scientifically sound justifications, good decision records, post-implementation verification, effectiveness, kappa, and management review that actually uses the quality data to make decisions. For example, imagine a site introduces a new critical component supplier. Now, if that site has a weak PQS, they will simply raise a change control, approve the supplier, and close the chain. But if the site has a really good, strong PQS, they will assess the product and process risk first, then review the supplier qualification evidence, update the technical agreements if required, assess the regulatory impact as well, define the post implementation monitoring effectiveness checks, and check early batch performance, and then feed the outcome into the management review and the product quality review as well. So the right hand box here is the key message. If a site can demonstrate PQS effectiveness, it may evenly gain more operational flexibility and reduce the duplicative regulatory assessment. But the benefit only comes if the site can provide clear inspection ready evidence. For training QPs, the practical takeaway here is before relying on the change control decision for batch certification, ask whether the evidence is complete enough to support the confidence in the batch and the system behind the batch. So, this pilot is just not an EMA project in the background. It is a signal that the future inspection may look much more closely at whether change control, QRM, Kappa, and management reviews are genuinely connected and effective. So, I discussed three main important themes in this module. Now, this slide actually bringing the three main themes of these modules together. At first, um, we see the NX1, NX15, and PQS effectiveness pilot. When we look, they may look separate, like a separate regulatory developments, but they are actually pointing in the same direction. The first thread is the Chapter 1 revision. This reframes the PQS around the life cycle quality risk management and gives the knowledge management much more clear visibility. The message here is that PQS should not simply react to the problem, it should use the risk and knowledge throughout the product life cycle to prevent the problems and support better decisions. The second thread is the NX15 extension. It takes the same life cycle discipline and applies it more strongly to the qualification and validation, including the API supply chain. So the expectation is not only the finished product site anymore. The finished product site is validated, but the API manufacturer is also supported by appropriate qualification, validation, change control, and process knowledge. And the third thread is the PQS effectiveness pilot. This asks the practical question behind both the first two developments. Can the site prove with evidence that its quality system actually working? For example, imagine a site introduces a new API supplier. Chapter 1 expects the change to be managed through quality risk management, your risk assessments, and the knowledge management coming out from your risk assessments or your PQS. The NX15 expectations would push the site to understand the supplier validation position. The PQS effectiveness would ask the whole system manage the change properly, from risk assessment and approval through implementation, monitoring, CAPA, if needed, the management review. So the most common threat is evidence. Regulators or inspectors are moving away from simply checking whether a procedure exists towards asking whether the system is genuinely functioning. For training QPs, the message is before certification of the badge, the question is not just was the badge got completed, also does the PQS behind this badge give me confidence that the risks are known, controlled, reviewed, and learned from um, the different experiences or incidents. The practical takeaway is to start a strong gap assessment, risk assessments, gap assessments now, even when where the final text has not yet been adopted, the direction is consistent. A modern PQS with a risk based, knowledge led life cycle and supported by evidence that it is effective. Now, to close this module, these are my key takeaways for you. First, there is a clear philosophical shift in PQS design. The direction is moving away from a quality system that reacts after a problem occurs towards a system that uses its risk management throughout the product life cycle. Knowledge management is also becoming more visible. It is no longer enough to have information stored somewhere. The sign needs to show that product process knowledge is captured, reviewed, used to make better quality decisions. For example, if a recurrent deviations in manufacturing, the question should be not only be was deviation closed. The question should be what was the learning? Was the learning captured, trended, risk assessed, fed back into the control strategy? Second, the PQR expectations are tightening. The product quality review should not be treated as an annual paperwork exercise. It should show whether the small number of batches each year, for example, for a product made only twice a year, the site may need to use the historical data, group product data, stability results, complaints, deviations, and process knowledge to support a meaningful review. Third, takeaway is Annex 15 needs early action, especially around the API suppliers. The proposed scope extension would bring much stronger qualification validation expectations into the active substances manufacturing. For finished product manufacturers, this means suppliers' oversight become more important than ever before. For example, if a critical API supplier, excuse me, changes a process step, the finished product side needs confidence that the change was validated, impurity risks were assessed, and any potential impact on the drug product was reviewed. Fourth, the PQS effectiveness pilot signals the future of inspections. The regulators are increasingly interested in whether the quality system actually works, not just whether the SOP exists. Immature sites should be able to show strong change governance, meaningful QRM, effective CAPA, post-implementation risk were properly assessed, implementation was controlled, and the outcome was verified after the change. And finally, we need to prepare ahead of the formal adaptation. But stay precise. Some of these items are still draft or pilot stage, so they should not be cited as final legal requirements in your controlled GMP procedures. But the direction is consistent enough to justify gap assessments now. The practical action after this module is to start with three main areas. Review your knowledge management processes, check your meaningful, like how meaningful your product quality reviews really are, and begin mapping high risk API suppliers against the Annex 1 style expectations from the concept paper. The overall message is that the PQS must give the QP confidence that the risks are known, controlled, um, um, effectively controlled, and the knowledge is retained, and the system can prove it is working. So the primary references for this webinar today were the draft Chapter 1 consultation itself, ICH Q9, Revision 1, Q10, Q12, which underpin the life cycle thinking running through it, Annex 15 concept paper, and EMA PQS effectiveness pilot documentation. Keep these for your own gap assessment references. Two of these, the Chapter 1 consultation and Chapter 15 concept paper, are the one to revisit as this reform moves from draft to adopted text over the coming months. So now that brings us to the end of Module 2, Modernizing the Pharmaceutical Quality System. In Module 3, we will move into Chapter 4 and Annex 11, Documentation and Computerized System. These two updates need to be read together because they cover data governance, audit trails, electronic records, and data integrity across the GMP lifecycle. Thank you for joining this webinar. I look forward to seeing you in Module 3. If you have any questions, please email us on info@academypharmaceuticalexcellence.com. I'll look forward to seeing you in the next module. Have a lovely evening or day, and thank you so much.